Hello everyone, and welcome to the next video in the course, which is the challenge for the functions section. Okay, so here is an outline of what the function is. So in the challenge, it's going to be like a menu system. So there should be 4 options: 1, sum of the vector; 2, average of the vector; 3, add the vector; and 4, display the vector. So obviously you'll have to have a vector with some values in it. So for example, it doesn't really matter how much, but preferably 5 or 6. And the person should be able to perform these functions. And it should keep displaying the options repeatedly. So for example, if you pressed 1, it would display the sum of the vector, and then it would display these possible functions again and allow the user to give a different input. For example, ask for the average of the vector. And when each input is received, once you determine what function is necessary, you should use functions to perform the operation rather than perform the operations in the, let's say, use if statements. Okay, and this is an example of the challenge. Okay, so it asks for the sum, the average, to add to the array, and to display the array. Okay, so first I'll just display the array. Okay, and it's just 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, and now let's say the mean or the average of the vector, and the average is 2. Let's say we want to add, and let's say 20. So now if we say 4 for display the vector, we should also see 20. Okay, so pause the video and have a go. When you're ready to view the solution, press play. Okay, so let's have a look at the challenge. So the first thing that we need to do is let's just create the vector that we are going to use. So we'll write include IOStream. And here what we have to include is vector so that we can use the vector. We'll say vector int, and I'm just going to call it main vector for now, and we'll say 1, 2, 3, 4. So it's really easy, and so we know the sum and we know the average. Okay, now let's give the user the option, and as I said, it has to repeat every time after each operation. So we're going to wrap this in a while true clause, so it continually repeats and never ends. While true, we're going to output the options. Okay, so we'll say 1, calculate the sum of the vector, and now to go to a new line, we can just say \n instead of having a different cout. So we can just say \n 2, calculate the mean or the average, and 3, add to the vector, and 4, display the vector. Okay, great. Now let's test that this works so far, but let's just create a cin. Let's say int selection number. Let's just write this into selection number. Okay, now let's check if this is working, and it's displaying line by line as we want it to. Okay, great. So just as we want, it displays on the different lines. Okay, great. So now what do we want to do? We want to check what number is given. So let's we could use an if statement, but what we can use here is switch. or switch case statements would probably be easier to use. So we'll say switch, and we are checking the selection number, so we'll say selection number. Okay, and case, if it's 1, let's just, for now, let's just output that it is calculating sum, and we'll put the break. Case 2, we'll say we are calculating the mean. The break. Case 3, it's going to be adding to the vector. Break. In case 4, we'll just output displaying vector. Okay, so that's simple enough, and we'll just put the break. Now let's test that this is working. Okay, so we'll run it. Okay, and if we write 1, it should say calculating the sum. Perfect. Now when we put 2, it should say calculating the average or the mean. Great. 3, it should say adding to the vector. And 4, it should say displaying the vector. Okay, perfect. So that's working fine. Now what we want to do is we want to create functions to perform the operations. So we want a function to calculate the sum. So let's do that first. Okay, so what we're going to do is we'll write over here the function. We'll say int sum of the vector. Actually, we'll put void since we're just going to output it. Let's say. Okay, and we'll say sum of the vector. Vector int, and we'll say my vector. Okay, and this is the body where we write the code to actually calculate the sum. Okay, great. So now what we will do is we'll say total is 0, and we'll say for int I equals 0, and while I is less than my vector dot size, to get the length of the vector, we'll say I plus plus, and for each incrementation we'll add to total the number in the vector at that specific place or specific location in the vector. So we'll say total plus equals my vector, and we'll say I. Okay, and now here we'll say output the sum of the vector is, and we'll say total. Okay, now let's check if this works. I've just gone up over this really quickly, but I'll go over this once again. So the for loop is essentially just going through each item in the array as we are indexing it, and it just adds that number to the total. So it's just going to be 0, 1 plus 1, then 1 plus 2, then 3 plus 3, and then 6 plus 4. Okay, so simple enough. Now let's check that this works, and we'll put sum vector, and we'll say my main vector. So we're passing in this vector into this function. Okay, so we'll save it, and we'll put 1, and the sum is 10. That's perfect. So 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus 4 is 10. Okay, great. So now what we will do is we'll say calculating the mean. Okay, so let's create the function. let's say average vector, and we'll pass in the vector. Okay, now how do we calculate the average? It's just the sum divided by how many there are, how many there are we are calculating. So in this case, we will do the sum of 1, 2, 3, 4 and divide it by 4, since there are 4 values. Okay, and we already have a function that gives us the sum. So what we can do is we can just call this function. But what's the problem with calling the function here? As you can see, it's a void, so it's not returning anything. So what we can do is we can just say int, so it does return something, and we can just say to return the sum. So then it's going to be easy for us, since we can just say int the total is sum of the vector, and we can just pass my vector, and we can say int average equals the total divided by the size of the vector, and for that we can just write my vector dot size. But again, we can write this easier by saying average equals sum vector my vector divided by my vector dot size. But I've just written it like this, so it's easier to understand. But either way is fine. Okay, so now we can just say cout the average of the vector is, and we'll just return average. Well, not return, output. Okay, and now let's write this in here. Average vector, and pass in main vector. Okay, so now let's check if this works. Calculate the mean. Okay, so we get the sum just because we get the sum here because in the function it outputs it, but we can fix that really quick, and we get the average is 2, and that's correct. So how can we fix the displaying of the sum? Okay, so what we can do here is, if we get rid of this, I'm just going to comment it out, we can make the output go here. So we can say the average is, and we can just do this, and that will work. Okay, so now let's look at adding to the vector. So adding to the vector, let's create the function. So let's say void add to vector, pass in parameter, and now let's say int number, and what we're going to do is we're going to ask the user what number they want to add. So we will say cout what number would you like to add? Okay, and we'll write this in to number. And now what we can do very easily is we can just say my vector dot pushback number. But there is something that we have to keep in mind. Here we have to put the and sign so that we can pass by reference rather than by value. Since if we did not have the and sign here, it would add it in the scope of the function, but it wouldn't add to our vector over here. Okay, so now we can just output added, and let's say number to the vector. Okay, so now let's try making the function for displaying vector. So with the display vector, we can check if the add to vector is working as well. Okay, so let's just write here add to vector main vector. Okay, so the displaying vector should be very easy to do, since we've done it before when we talked about vectors and arrays. So we can just say display vector, and we don't need it as a reference, we can just have it as a value, and here we can just say for int I equals 0, and then I plus plus, and just output my vector I. Okay, so now let's check if this is working. The first thing we'll test is the display vector. So I'll say for oh, I didn't add it to the switch case, so we'll say display vector main vector. Okay, so now let's run it, and I'll say display vector 1 2 3 4. That's correct. Now let's try adding to the vector. I'm going to say 50. Now if we display it, we get 50. Great. Okay, so that's all there is to this challenge. I hope you were able to follow along, and I will see you in the next video. Thank you.